Welcome to the 100th episode of Anchored in Education. I am not E. Scott England, I'm Chris Briggs-Hale. Don't worry, Scott hasn't been kidnapped and is not tied up in the back room. To celebrate the 100th episode of Anchored in Education, Scott has asked me to flip the table on him. Instead of doing the interviewing, he's going to be interviewed. There's a good reason for this. By interviewing Scott, you might think differently about how much work can get done just by listening to the stories of educators from whom you don't usually hear. Anchored in Education has, for 100 episodes, been celebrating what happens when we give voice to the 99% of educators or people who aren't always sharing their craft publicly. It's the voices you don't often hear from that most anchor us all in education. As learners, we can't always travel on the surface of the ocean of knowledge. Sometimes we have to slow down and drop anchor to find out what else is deep below us. One of Scott's favorite questions to ask his guests is, what else? And when we ask that, we hear new thinking from the voices deep in the system that floats learning for all. Whether we agree or disagree with those voices matters less than knowing these voices were deeply heard, because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. So here we go, giving a platform to the man whose heart is focused on giving it to everyone else.
Wow. I tell you what, Chris, that was an incredible opening. I feel like I can't even live up to that, but I'm excited for this conversation that we're going to have today. You absolutely, I believe, captured the essence of what Anchored in Education is all about. And, especially to me, if you're in the field, you have a voice, you have a spot, an anchor to drop, like you said. And I think that is what is important, that you look out into the sea of education, and there we are, anchored, and sometimes we pull up anchor and we move as our beliefs or philosophies or practices change. And with that, and that's what, it's such a fluid profession. It's so fun. So thank you for agreeing to take over Anchored in Education as the host today. And I got to tell you, now I know what 99 other guests have felt like being on this side, and I'm nervous but excited. Let's have fun.
Oh, absolutely. You always get me thinking. And one of the things you just got me thinking about was that metaphor that I used, which was sometimes we do pull up the anchor when we catch a lovely wind that brings us somewhere purposefully and intentionally. And we allow that to happen. But at the end of the day, we drop back down into the things that we know are our deep values and the things that really matter, and we know work with students and learners. So, okay, I have to ask the question.
All right.
That you always ask, because it's fascinating. Before we get started talking about Anchored in Education, we'd like to find out a little more about you, Scott, and how you became anchored in education.
Yeah, and what? thanks for really flipping that one on me. And I know that for listeners out there, you and I, we've had a couple times where we've met and had an idea of what the direction's going. But honestly, I don't know exactly where the conversation will take us, because that's the many times that we've been together, we've had this, it before you know it, 10 minutes turns into an hour and a half, and we're like, oh man, we've got stuff we've got to get done. But I knew this question was coming, and there was no hiding from it. And I'm so glad, because it is one of my favorite things to talk about, becoming anchored in education. So I knew when I was in high school that I wanted to be an educator. And whether or not in a high school I could point to my first grade teacher as the influence, I'm not sure, but I'll get to the influence of a first grade teacher and a second grade teacher in just a minute. But I knew that I was going to be a teacher. And so, as all well-laid plans happen, that changed when I began to look at salaries of teachers versus at the big time when I graduated high school, business administration was huge. And I knew nothing about business. I didn't even know what business administration is. I just knew like business means money, administration means leading, like put them together. Yes, I want to be a business administrator major. That lasted probably one semester. And thankfully, the classes that I took for that were able to go into education because I shifted into education. I was just at a community college. That's where I got my start, and it was great for me. Was not a great student in high school. In fact, my guidance counselor in high school, when he found out I wanted to be on a college track, pulled me aside and said, "You're more of a vocational student. Maybe you should look at something else other than college." So there's another influence right there of what anchored me in education, that somebody listened to what I was saying and then completely discredited what I wanted. You know what I mean? Like, if that was the case, he shouldn't have ever asked, "What do I want to be whenever I'm out of high school?" He should have just said, "This is what you're going to be." Because when he said, what do you want to be?" I mistakenly thought he cared. and apparently he didn't. But man, the power an educator can have over someone, because I went to the community college and I didn't do great. Like, I'm talking, I don't know that I had a 3.0 after my 2 years when I graduated. And the thing is, I chalked it up every time to, well, I'm not supposed to be here anyway. I'm not supposed to be college material. So if I get a C in this class, so be it. That's where I'm supposed to be. It just weighed on me all the time of, being able to discredit myself because someone else had discredited me in the past. And so, I wanted to be a high school English teacher. Finished community college, went to a 4-year university. I only lasted a semester. I did not fail out because I withdrew from all my classes within the proper amount of time to get my money back. But what I wanted to do instead, I wanted to work. I wanted to start a family. I wanted to make money. And so I left. I left and I never finished the 4-year university right then. Instead, I went to work in factories, got married, had first child when I was 23. And, I worked a variety of jobs. I worked at TV stations. I worked at multiple factories doing things. I did a stint working at a hotel. And then I became a truck driver manager for a truck driving company. And which is funny because when I was 7, I always wanted to be a truck driver. But that's neither here nor there. That never worked out. But so I went into truck driver management, and then we had an economy turn around on us and kind of tank. And with that, the company had to downsize. I was the newest one, so I was the first to be downsized. And so it was actually, my wife had said, I heard an advertisement on the radio for an accelerated bachelor's at Millikan University, which is a private university in Decatur, Illinois, to become an educator. And she said, now the only thing is it's for elementary education. Remember, I wanted to be a high school English teacher, but in this time, my son had been born and I've been able to watch him grow. And so then that's what really took me back to that first grade teacher and that second grade teacher. And the first grade teacher was Mrs. Kazel. The second grade teacher I won't name, because Mrs. Kazel was beyond loving, nurturing, caring. She taught me so much. There's still things from first grade that I can remember, and I can remember where I was sitting in that classroom that no longer exists because the school's been torn down. But I can tell you where I was when the lesson happened. I can tell you how I learned, how to spell certain things, how to read certain ways because of Mrs. Kazel. I remember one time I sharpened a crayon and the pencil sharpener, huge no-no. I had to, as a first grader, serve a lunch detention. But the way Mrs. Kazel handled that, I learned to respect property. I learned not to, it was handled in a way where I did not feel like I had done something wrong. She gently corrected me, And it was amazing. Then I got into second grade with the teacher who shall not be named, kind of like a Lord Voldemort kind of thing, was the exact opposite and made my life as a second grader, mind you, an 8-year-old, miserable. Yeah. And I come to find out later that she was going through some personal things, everything. But I learned then that's, you have to learn to check yourself at the door and, leave personal stuff outside, because when you're in school, like, you've got impressionable minds. And I mean, man, she really turned me off of schooling and everything else. I can remember specifics of just the way, she looked when she spoke to me. And so I always told myself, 2 teachers have influenced me into education, and both were night and day in the experiences. But I wanted to be that elementary teacher that could reach those kids, that could, be the nurturing, be the strict, but in a guiding, loving, teaching way. And so that's what happened. I did the accelerated course. I became a first grade teacher. I finished student teaching on a Friday and was put into a full-time classroom the following Monday at a different school. And talk about, drinking from the fire hose when you're just thrust into teaching. But I loved every minute of it. So I taught first grade. I became an elementary principal. I became a superintendent of a rural community down in southern Illinois. The pandemic was rough. I stepped down from being a superintendent and reevaluated my life, and so to speak. I mean, I was 37 on 2 blood pressure medications, and I loved what I was doing, but it wasn't worth dying for. And so I went back and became a third grade teacher. And then here I am. Now I'm a university professor, and like I said, I've picked up the anchor and I've moved it different places, but that's me. That's how I became anchored.
It sounds like children have always anchored you, because what I'm hearing you say in that wonderful story is that when you started it with, I knew I was going to be a teacher, and then there was Mrs. Kazel, and then there was the teacher who, and then there was the high school person who discredited you and didn't care. And then your son was born.
Yeah.
And then your son was born, and you what do you make of that cycle there, coming back through your son and that connection to Mrs. Kazel?
Yeah, I think that is a lot of just the beautiful of being unprepared for parenthood.
Oh yeah.
You think like, okay, I know how this is going to be. People will give you advice. You can read books. I think I read all of the books on parenting for that first child. And then he's born, and then they place this, newly born, minutes old, swaddled infant in your hands, and you realize everything that you've been told is completely out the window, because each minute is such a different experience. And, watching my son go from, a crying, nursing baby to all of a sudden, he's sleeping through the night and he's rolling over, and, he's sleeping on his stomach when, everything I read said they can't sleep on their stomach. And I'd go in, I'd flip him over onto his back, and, I'd walk out, and as I'm walking out, he's flipping back over to his stomach. And I realized, like, you have to adapt, you have to adjust, you have to meet the kids where they are. And so, along the way came the second child. I read nothing for her. It's like, okay, not wasting my time. I already know you're going to completely throw a wrench in whatever we do. And my goodness, she was a wrench thrower for like the first three years. But that is, to me, it was so exciting with each milestone of, whether, we always talk about the milestones of first words and all that. But there's so many more milestones that only parents really recognize. And it's not even something that we celebrate with the world, but it's just the little things, whether it's a recognition of a song or a show or a moving a different way, like be able to really watch how they begin to grow. Like I wanted to be part of that for not just my own children, but I wanted to be that for others too, and bring in students that, have a foundation of sounds and words and the letter ideologies and everything else, but not necessarily being able to put it together yet, and then guiding them. And all of a sudden we're readers, and we can decode and we can write, and just watching how that from the day 1 to day 180, whatever it is, like, oh my goodness, the growth, it's so exciting. And it's it keeps me going. And the same thing happens now. I work with much older students. I've gone from trading the 7-year-olds and the 9-year-olds in for, adult learners who's, enrolled in their, a terminal degree program, going to end with their doctorate, but be able to watch them grow. Like, man, I love it. It's like a human gardener.
It's interesting you say watch them, because in education, a lot of times there's this word knowing and expertise.
Yeah.
And what's ironic about it, what I heard you say when your first child was born, was you suddenly threw everything you thought you knew out the window.
Everything.
And it allowed you to show up for both of your children in this place of unknowing, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I agree with. When I was a principal, after being a principal for a very long time, I used to say to parents, hang in there. You're doing a good job. Just remember, if your children are in therapy for something different than you were in therapy for, you are being a good parent.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I've heard so many people talk about that parents are sending the best version of their child to school. Absolutely. And, the first time I heard that, I was thinking, well, clearly you haven't seen, where I work.
Right.
But the more that, and again, is that part of picking up where I had anchored myself at that time and then moved to a more understanding, a more appreciative, a more, something of how education works, because it's true. Even the students that cause, substantial disruptions and everything else, the parents are doing what they can. And it might not be what our expectations are. It might not be what we would do as parents. It might not be what we, would recommend if we were in that position to recommend how parents raise their kids. But they're doing the best they can and sending us the best they have. And it's our job then to work with that. And so, let me go back just to, try to explain it maybe better, is that, my parents were sending the very best of me to high school. And, the very best of me, I did like to joke around. I did, for some teachers, like to, twist the barb and the side to, test the waters, so to speak. But it was still, that was the very best of me. I still wanted to go to college and to have so many that viewed me as what I was doing or how I conducted myself as this is the be all end all to this guy. Like, he's not going to be anything more than just a crack up jokester. And, man, it's so profound. But my parents were sending the best that they had. Neither of my parents finished college. And, I was fortunate. I've got 3 other siblings, and all 4 of us have graduated, from a 4-year university with a bachelor's or higher. And so, but my parents didn't have that. So they were sending me the best that they could.
So what I find so fascinating about your story is that, Mrs. Kazel was really important, and so are all teachers who can plant that seed. And even though you had a teacher that discredited you, much later on, the gravity of Miss Kaisel's influence in the birth of your son drew you back to that place where you knew you needed to be a teacher.
Yeah.
How did that embracing of that lead you to become so fascinated with the stories that people have to share that they don't always share?
Sure, that's a great question, and I want to answer that, but I want to add. It's always, and I always try to find somewhere in the story on when I can add the bombshell layer, if you will.
Oh yeah,
on that. And so now that you've mentioned Mrs. Kaisel, it's my opportunity to say that as I was in this accelerated program to go back and get my bachelor's, it was time to do my student teaching. Everybody was getting their student teaching placements because you had to do X amount of hours of observation the semester before you student taught. And everybody was getting theirs. I wasn't getting mine. And at the time, I worked as a one-to-one special education aide in the school district in which I graduated from. I worked in the middle school, and I was going to student teach in elementary school. And so I said, there's an elementary school here. Can I student teach? And they said, no, you can't student teach where you went to school. I said, well, I understand that. That's a great policy for those who are right out of school, but it's been like 10 years since I've graduated, and it's been like another 15, 12 years since I've been in elementary school. Like, I think I'm safe. And so then the next problem was my son was going to be in kindergarten. And they're like, well, you can't be in the school in which your son attends. I'm like, well, I can't argue that because I'm not changing my schools. But they couldn't find anybody. And so I wasn't even updated. And long story short, but it's all part of it. And it's just an exciting part of my story that will lead into to help answer the question on how stories became an important part. That I get an email one day, and I was at work, maybe on lunch, I can't remember. I remember where I was in the middle school in the classroom in which I worked, and I look at this email, and it said, Scott, we have found you a cooperating teacher that has agreed to take you on, and because we couldn't find any other school, we've decided to allow you to teach in the school in which you went, Sullivan Elementary School. And would you guess? I mean, it's the lead-in has, I'm sure, spoiled it, but my cooperating teacher was Mrs. Kaisel.
Oh,
and
that is so fantastic. I did not know that. That is,
yeah. And so, yeah, however many, 20 years later, because, well, yeah, it would have been 20 years. 20 years after I had finished first grade in Miss Kaisel's class, I returned. I returned as a student teacher and a mentee under her. And, she was, when I student taught, 69 or 70. I mean, and still teaching these first graders. And so, it was that one thing, like whenever I talked to her, so I ran into Mrs. Kaisel just, probably a couple months ago. She's in her 80s now, and she was at the store, and I mean, she looks just like she did when she was a teacher. Looks fantastic. But the question every time I see her, and if I could do my best Mrs. Kaisel impression, I would, but I can't even capture the essence of how wonderful it is. But the thing she always says is, the first question is, Scott, how are you? What are you up to? Like, that's what she wants. And so then every time I talk, it's always a question, and it's a question to keep me going. And like in her mind, so I had a university supervisor whenever I student taught, and it's even slipping my mind. I want to say his name was like Bill or Mr. William. I don't even know. But every time I run into Mrs. Kaisel, still today, after nearly 2 decades, she says, how is Mr. So-and-so? Like, she remembers him. And she wants to know, like, how are his grandkids? I'm like, I haven't talked to this guy since, but it always inspired me. Like, she genuinely cares what people are doing, what people have to say. And I've taken that piece and to talking to people, like I want to know what people have to say, and I value. And I may, and I've talked to plenty of people, and especially if anybody's on social media, you see plenty of people you disagree with. And it's okay, because that's what makes up this world. That's what keeps us unique and diverse, and I love it. But you'll never get to find out where somebody stands if you don't find out their story. And that is why we always open, how'd you become anchored in education? And I've got so many, especially in coming up in the next couple months, I have so many guests that have not been educators, but they're still anchored in education through something. They were inspired by a teacher. They work with, teachers. They work with educators. Their parent was an educator, whatever it may be. Like, I don't care who you are. I can find a way in which education has influenced something you've done in your life. And maybe it's that you completely hate school. Guess what? You're still anchored. You're still anchored in education. You harbor such a negative view and everything, but you're still anchored. So then I want to talk to you. If you hate school, if you hate everything about education, if you hate everything about teachers and the system and whatever, great. Tell me why. Tell me more. Tell me what we can do for your generation coming up to change it. What can we do to make it different?
I love that you constantly point to these ongoing moments of unknowing, of not knowing, and that you always shift to a question as a moment of rebirth. Just like when you came back around at the birth of your son and started asking questions and getting inside other people's heads.
Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
The longer I'm in this business, the longer I realize what's in your head is less important than education is about developing the skills to get inside and merge brains.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, if you truly want to be, and of course, I guess the lens that I look out of the most is leadership, especially, I'm a professor of education leadership, and that's the program and everything else. I mean, I like to think that I could step into a higher ed course of elementary classroom management and be able to work in that. But,
Sure.
The leadership lens and everything else, that is where I think the desire to ask the questions comes in. But, the thing is, anybody can ask a question.
Right.
That, anybody can do that. And I think a lot of people do that. And through your coaching and everything else, that it's not the question and it's not necessarily the answer, but we're getting more towards it. It's the ability to listen. And it's the ability to understand. It's the ability to know, is a response needed? Do I need to follow up with a more clarifying question or a story, or do I simply thank them for sharing and move on? You don't know. You don't know until you have the conversation what the driving of the next part is, but you have to be able to listen for an answer and respond appropriately. And
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I did that especially when I became superintendent. I knew the building I had worked in. I knew those teachers pretty well. But I didn't know teachers from the other building. And so I made it a point in that first year of stopping by and visiting with teachers on their planning time. If they weren't busy, always ask if they got a minute. And, but I would listen and I would ask. And one of the things I always asked, and the first people I went to were the ones that were retiring, because I only had one shot to talk to them. It was that year, because after that, they were retiring. And so those were the ones I went to first. But the first question I always asked, how did you end up teaching? And it's amazing to watch people kind of reflect back on how they became in the role and the different things. But then, once we got through that, it's like, tell me who you are as a person. And I still remember a conversation with a guy that he said, a lot of people don't know, but I love to fish, and I own 50 some acres, outside of town. Like, I had no idea. He's like, well, I'm going to find myself there in retirement. And, as I would talk to people, like I didn't have anything to distract me. I always have a rule. If I'm talking with you in a meeting, I don't look at my phone. It can be ringing, going off, everything. I'm not looking at it. And so I never pulled the phone out of my pocket while I was talking to him. I didn't have anything to write with. But as soon as I was done, I took the path of least resistance back to my office, opened up my computer, brought up my Word document, and I typed up all the notes from the conversation that we had. And so I could go back and I could really take in everything that they've said, and then I could bring that up in a conversation later on to further connect with them. And it's all about that continued story. And, I talked with that teacher with the acreage and the pond early on in the year, and on the last day of school, I went back and I said, I really hope that you enjoy your time on that 56 acres, and I hope that we have a chance to catch up out there sometime. And he looked at me with just like a shocked, I can't believe you remembered that. Well, absolutely. It was important for you to say, so it's important for me to remember. And that goes back to, I think, what we were saying on if somebody hates school. It's important enough for you to tell me you hate school, or you think I'm a bad teacher, or you think I'm that. So I respect that. What can I do differently?
What I love about the work you've been doing in Anchored in Education is that you have been demonstrating that listening isn't about receiving. It's a gift. Yeah. Because if people think 800 words a minute but can only speak 100 words, right?
Yeah.
And so when we give that gift of helping people say what it is that they're actually trying to say, rather than just letting the sound waves hit our ears and reacting,
right?
That gift is pretty amazing. And in education, I think that the Anchored in Education has helped highlight how essential that is in the development of our thinking in our brain, and how we learn to better leverage the thinking of other people.
Well, I'm glad that is what has come out to you as a listener. I know that, we've had this conversation, but you are, you're an avid listener. I even saw in a most recent newsletter a shout out to the podcast in your newsletter. And,
yes.
I appreciate that, because that is the goal of Anchored in Education, is to, to just have the conversations of what is the driving factor. Because if somebody writes an article about, two episodes ago was Hank writing. He wrote an article on note taking, and when I asked Hank to be on, it brought up memories of me being in education. But I even thought, like, this is working for Hank, and I love what he's doing, but there's going to be someone out there that completely disagrees with note-taking or using the notes or testing twice, whatever. But the thing is, that's great. If you disagree with that, then disagree with that and don't do that. But it works for Hank, and I love it. I would love for someone to do something like that whenever I was in school. I'm wondering how much more stuff would have stuck if I would have been taught that. And so it's getting things like that. Yeah. Like, obviously that meant something to Hank. He wrote about it, and I read it, and I thought, why is Hank not on Anchored in Education? It's the same thing. That's how you ended up on, talking about no more vague school action plans. And yes. I identified with that. And that's how we get these, like, there's a lot of big names out there, much bigger than me, but.
Well, I agree with you. And when I read, just to get to your point here, when I
Yeah.
read, is it Elizabeth Dampf?
Yes.
When I
Yes.
read her article, my first reaction was I was incensed because I loved teaching.
Yeah.
I loved it. I loved being in the classroom. Her article challenged me to really think, it's that moment. It's the birth of your son. It's the, wait, stop. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm getting in my own way as a teacher because I think because I love teaching so much, that means I can do no wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe it's in my own mind a barrier to my own evolution. Her article blew my mind, and the way
I know.
that you listened to her. And then who was it that wrote the book with the swear word on the cover?
Jody Eckleberry Hunt.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So what happens when we make it safe to say things that people disagree with
Yeah.
or might disagree with? What happens when we make it really safe?
Well, I would like to think so. Civil discourse is something that is always on the front of my mind, and the thing is, it more so the display of both parties during this year's State of the Union address could not have bolstered the foundation of why we have anchored in education all together, because we have to be able to disagree. We have to be able to have dissenting opinions. We have to be able to look at what somebody says that they believe in and recognize that is their belief, and we do not have the right to say you're wrong, because we're essentially saying your belief is wrong. And I mean, and we do that. I mean, we can even think about, just religious persecution, and we can talk about, cultural differences and everything. We've been doing this for years, and, but it's been wrong for years. But rather than taking a page out of what's been wrong, we continue to do it, and it's getting worse. And so, I remember where I was in Chicago when I read Elizabeth Dampf's article, and I was the same way, thinking, who is this to tell me that I can't be thankful and love the profession? But that's not what she was saying.
It's not.
And I went back and I had to read the other article, the first one that she wrote that listed the response of the second blog that she had done.
Yeah.
And that, that challenged me as a person, because, I mean, I can tell you on my first read through, I thought, no way in God's green earth is this a guest on Anchored in Education.
That's right.
And then I read it again and I thought, only on God's green earth is this
That's right.
a guest on Anchored in Education, a valued guest. And the conversation I had with Elizabeth and putting that together, like, she completely got me to think and challenged my thinking. And I realized in so many ways she's right. Like, yeah, I'm a teacher.
Agreed.
I'm a professional. I say it all the time. I didn't realize how similar my narrative was to Elizabeth's. I was just doing something different. So I talk all the time about policy and politics and education. And I say all the time, give us back our profession. Stop meddling with it. Stop giving mandates. Stop trying to say that you know what you're doing, because we are the professionals in this. And
That's right.
And that's exactly what Elizabeth was saying. Like, don't feed us full of pizza and give us ice cream sundae parties while completely taking control of our curriculum. Like, no.
That's such a good, that's just the lesson of her, and the lesson of the journey you took to put her on is so important, because and as a coach, I know that whenever I'm angry or whenever someone else is angry, that means there's something to be learned.
Oh, absolutely. And that's so true. You look at so many things that people are upset with, and rather than dive in, we stay at that surface level of, we decide if we're going to be upset with them and join in, or if we're going to argue against them, but we don't dive into Why is the person upset? Why does this matter? And we don't. I was actually thinking about this morning as I was walking in. We don't think of, is what the person's saying even true? And gone is the day where we seek factual information. We just, if you got an audience, you can say it. Like, I mean, if you think about it, I potentially have a very dangerous platform with a podcast and Anchored in Education, and that I can say whatever I want. I don't have to have facts with it. But I do. I don't say whatever I want. If I give an opinion, I let you know this is what I think. Hey, if you agree, that's great. If you don't, don't. So I had Kellen Cyrock as a guest back in the fall talking about structured literacy. And, one of the things.
Loved that one.
Yeah. Oh, I tell you what, if I could figure out a way to put Kellen in some sort of legislature, or U.S., state, whatever it is, like amazing person. And she, she's got it down on how to advocate for kids, how to advocate for the profession, how to ask the right questions. Like, okay, she's got that. Clearly, I'm a Kellen Cyrock fan. But at the end of that episode, because I knew we're in such, a debate on reading, the science of reading and all of that. There's the podcasts that have come out just solely focused on that I offered, like, hey, if you don't agree with what I'm saying here, because I was aligned with Kellen, or if you don't agree with what Kellen has said today, reach out. Let's have a conversation. Like, you have a spot on this podcast to come in and tell me why you think we're wrong and what you think it should be instead. And that to me is how you can be responsible within the profession to help disseminate a message.
Well, I think your point about surface and, going the surface level and how that can make you dangerous as a podcaster is really important. But I think that's why when you say what else, when you stop, you notice how you're reacting to it and you recognize, oh, I think there's something to be learned here.
Yeah.
Because then whether the facts are true or not on the surface, you get to, or you give the gift to that person of helping them express who they really are.
Yeah.
And they can accept that invitation or they can't, or they will.
Yeah.
But that's an amazing gift when you ask, what else? Or tell me more about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing stuff. I'm just thinking here for a second.
Yeah. Well, while you're thinking for a second, I'll give you the last piece of my story in becoming
Please.
Anchored in Education. It's always, things are best delivered in 3, right? I don't know if that's even true. See, that's just an example of you can say things and then, now everybody's going to be like, well, if there's not 3, then it must not be important. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
So I finished student teaching with Mrs. Kazel, I told you, on a Friday, and then a different school district had hired me to take over for a teacher that was, they're making some mid-year moves. And so that was in November. And then I get it was in spring of the following year, finishing up my first year teaching, I get a phone call. And it was from the elementary school in which I had graduated from, the elementary school in which my son was in, and the elementary school in which I had just finished a student teaching experience. They called and they said, Mrs. Kazel has decided to retire, and we would like to talk to you about taking her position. And so they didn't hand it to me. I went and I had to apply and go through all that, and I interviewed. But I was hired and I took over for Mrs. Kazel. And I mean, I guess this is just, sometimes I say it how it is. I don't care what people think of that, bit of the story. Every time I say it, I still get goosebumps and chills because it's such, I mean, it rounded out my whole where I started and being a teacher to coming back around and being that teacher. And I essentially got to end where I began in a different capacity. And, you know, it's just, I think all the time, like, there is no way, because people ask me, you know, where, if you are, I've been asked before, like, you know, oh, do you wish that you would have just finished school and started? Because I would have been like, you know, 10 years close, not quite 10, but almost 10 years closer to retirement if I would have, you know, stayed the path. And I think all the time, yeah, you know, that would have been great, but I wouldn't have this incredible story. I wouldn't have, you know, my anchored in education would look completely different. And I tell people, if I would have went from community college to the 4-year university and I would have finished, I would have been a teacher by the age of 21, 22 in a classroom. And if it still would have been high school I wouldn't be a teacher. I would have burned out. I would have been, you know, it's my life experiences that brought me around to where I am. And I wouldn't trade it. Not a bit.
That's amazing. That is for all of you out there who are in the classroom right now, remember this story. You don't know the impact you're having 30 years from now.
No.
No.
Absolutely. And remember, that impact can be either way. It can be positive or it can be negative. Like, there should never be a time in which you think I'm not making an impact. And you're describing two different people. One, when the teacher who shall not be named, she was stuck in her own head. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Kazel, she was more interested in what was in your head. Yeah. Great way to put it. I love that.
I'm so glad I didn't have another question to ask, because then you finished that story.
Yeah.
And that is the story.
That's, you know, I think you're right. It's a great culmination of a walk down 100 episodes of Anchored in Education and the purpose. And I think it's just important, and maybe it's never been communicated. And I think that's why we had to have this conversation today, to find out that this isn't a self-serving interest that I have. Like, I mean, and you have seen now, as, you know, taking over for an episode, like, it's not as easy as pressing record and going at it. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And I don't say that for sympathy from anybody. Like, I just want them to understand, like, you know, the Anchored in Education is for anybody who's listening. You know, it's not for me. I also gain, but, you know, if I have one listener and we learn, I'm happy with it, and I'll keep doing it.
You know what? I prepared for this episode on and off for 2 months and wrote 15 questions, and I only asked the first one.
Yeah. But because you took the principles of what Anchored in Education does and built on that. And, you know, I know that when I have guests, I have, you know, I offer guiding questions, but, you know, you've been a guest, so you can see the guiding questions versus where the conversation goes.
Yeah.
It's never just let me ask these 6 questions and be done, you know, and that's the same. Like, I don't put a time limit on Anchored in Education. Now, there's been times where I've cut down episodes to make them 2 parts, just to maybe get more listeners or not overwhelm people with a bunch of information at once. Yeah. But it's not a cookie cutter thing. Like, every episode is unique because every educator is unique.
Well, isn't that a beautiful gift, is to have that while to just get lost in somebody else's thinking and then allow it to really challenge you and see where that leads you. Yeah. See what your circle will be from, you know, each of us has a circle where we started somewhere, we just knew something, and then life takes us around in a journey, And either we come back to that moment or we don't. But it sure is nice to be able to slow down and hear those stories from people.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
especially you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'll let you bring it home. But this has been fun. So I appreciate you taking the time. And like I said, the 2 months of preparing. And I know that through our conversation, like you didn't take this task lightly. Yeah, I'm honored. I'm honored that you could serve as the host today of Anchored in Education, and I appreciate the friendship.
Well, you bet. Me too. Let's keep it up.
Yeah.
You can find Scott online at his website, www.escottengland.com. Before I wrap up today's episode, don't forget to head over to Scott's website and find all 99 of the previous episodes. It's also a great place to find out more about each of his guests and how you can learn more about and hopefully from each of them. To find out more about today's host, me, Chris Briggs-Hale, check out my website at waterfalllearning.com. Don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Listening to most of the 100 episodes of Anchored in Education taught me how underrated the skill of deep listening is in our educational practice. I don't know about you, but when Scott was given the space to complete the story of his long journey back to his first grade teacher, Mrs. Kazel, I found myself experiencing something I think I need more of: awe, pure awe. When we create space for others to share their unique stories, even when we don't agree, something magical happens. I believe it is because in order to listen deeply to another person, we have to let go of our own thoughts. This is hard and sometimes a scary thing to do. Our own thoughts are generally safe. We know what they'll be. Letting these go in order to really hear others introduces us into a space of not knowing, particularly in regards to what that other person might teach us. When someone feels deeply listened to, it's a liberating moment for them. They know they have a reprieve from the normal assumptions, biases, and schedules that drive unskilled listening. When we truly become lost in another person's words, they blossom right in front of us. Our purpose of today's episode was to highlight how simply asking questions like, "What else?" and then trusting the silence in the moments following deepens learning for everyone. Listening is a critical anchor in education. As you ponder the things that anchor you in education, we hope these moments with Scott illuminate new opportunities for those you serve. As I hand the host chair and the microphone back to Scott, I'd like to thank him and all of his 99 other guests. I think we're all grateful for this podcast. Every guest, in his or her or their unique ways, reveals new stories that anchor us all in education.